Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Angie Marable, and I'm the Director of Engineering at Upside Business Travel. We're a small tech startup based out of Washington, D.C., trying to shake things up and change the way that we do business travel. I have here with me Jay Gorrell, our lead site reliability engineer from our infrastructure automation team, here to talk to you today about the implementation of Spinnaker at Upside and the decision making that went into deciding that the time was right for Spinnaker. So before we get started, I'll just outline a little bit of what we're going to talk about. First, we'll sort of set the stage for you and give you some context to what we were working with before with our legacy deployment system. Then we'll dig into some details with Jay on his thought process behind choosing Spinnaker and coming up with an implementation plan and deciding that the time was now. And then after that, we will go and touch base on the progress of the Spinnaker implementation at Upside, and then see if he has any advice to give to others who may be just starting out on their journey with Spinnaker. So without further ado, I will like to say hello, Jay. Thanks for joining today. Why don't you go ahead and give folks a little bit of an idea about who you are and your role at Upside?
Sure. Thanks, Angie, and thanks for putting this all together. So yeah, my background, I started in web development. I realized the front end wasn't for me and quickly moved further and further down the stack until I started getting more into the infrastructure side of things. Once there, I kind of found the passion for containers, and then that was around the time Kubernetes was coming around. So I developed a lot of interest in that. So Upside started to become a company around that time, and they wanted to do containers and probably on Kubernetes. So that was an opportunity for me to, take a jump to a brand new startup and try that out. So joined Upside about 4 years ago as lead for the SRE team. And since then, I've been managing all things infrastructure, CI/CD pipelines, things like that.
Well, great. Well, let's just go ahead and jump right into it then. Tell me a little bit about Upside's previous deployment strategy.
Yeah, so I guess to talk a little bit about the environment first, like I mentioned, Upside had plans to do Docker and Kubernetes. So we are talking about containerized environments. So that's what our deployment targets are. As far as our existing deployment pipeline, we used a CI tool like most people do. In our case, it was Circle CI. That was responsible for building the images and then pushing those to an artifact storage system. And then Circle would kick off a job in Jenkins. So Jenkins was kind of that core piece that manages the deployments themselves. So Jenkins was responsible for running a pipeline that would, deploy the container to our Kubernetes cluster in our dev environment. It would make sure the deployment comes up healthy. It would publish metrics to Datadog for stats. It would also publish changelog information to Slack, so users would, get some of that output. And then we also had one other piece, which is a Slack bot that kind of abstracted Jenkins from the users. So that's how people would deploy to stage or to production. They didn't really interact directly with Jenkins, but that's kind of a high level view of what our existing pipeline looked like.
Okay, and so with that pipeline, what were some pain points that you had with that that got you motivated to start looking for some alternatives or changes to make?
Yeah, so Jenkins is the core piece we're talking about here for the deployment pipeline, where in the new system with Spinnaker, we're still going to have Circle building images. But for the Jenkins system, it does have a bit of a reputation. I think most people know that have worked with it. It's a little cumbersome, difficult, maybe repetitive when you're writing your pipeline templates. They're largely in Groovy, but oftentimes, depending on what you're doing, you may write, Bash scripts or Python scripts. So you have a single file with maybe 3 different languages. There's a lot of nuances in there. And then, there's overhead with managing Spinnaker and the plugins that come, or sorry, not Spinnaker, with Jenkins and the plugins that come with it. So I think it was just kind of the operational overhead that came with that.
Okay, and were there any complaints from the engineers that had to use that system that also precipitated you looking into alternatives?
I, on the engineering side, not so much, because like I mentioned, we did have a Slack bot that abstracted the usage away from them. The biggest impact to engineers was when, we broke something in the Jenkins pipelines. Of course, everyone notices then, but the day-to-day usage, no one actually logs into Jenkins to execute pipelines or look at anything. Um, if anything, I would say maybe a lack of visibility into what it's doing because they use Slack to interface with it. They kick something off and it's, a bit of a black box and they don't really have details or insight into what's going on there.
Gotcha. Well, so when you were then researching alternatives to sort of the Jenkins function in the pipeline, what made Spinnaker stand out to you over other alternatives that you were exploring?
Yeah. So I think the big thing that stood out to us was this built-in knowledge that Spinnaker has of Kubernetes resources. So for example, when we're doing a deployment on Kubernetes, Spinnaker already has built-in knowledge to know if that deployment is healthy or not. It's not just Kubernetes, but if you're doing like a ELB in AWS, Spinnaker knows if the ELB is healthy. So it's able to use that to determine if the current stage in your deployment pipeline is successful or not before continuing on to the next stage. Um, let's see, there are a lot of players in the space that we evaluated.
Okay.
They often are either very bare bones where you construct things from scratch, which is kind of where Jenkins is at. Tecton is another one that's a little more cloud native. Then on the other side, there's Argo CD and things that are more batteries included and very opinionated with how you do things. Spinnaker just fit this really nice place in the middle where it had these pre-built stages and pre-built understanding of Kubernetes resources, but we didn't have to code things from scratch either. It had the right size building blocks that we were looking for.
So it provided a good framework then that you could work with and then customize.
Yeah, exactly. It gave us the flexibility we needed without being too low level.
Gotcha. Well, great. So you've done the analysis, you've chosen Spinnaker as the next step for the company. Then you come up with an implementation strategy. What were some concerns that you had surrounding sort of the implementation of Spinnaker and starting off on that journey?
Yeah, so one thing I haven't really mentioned yet is the primary driver for moving to Spinnaker, a new solution, was to get to continuous deployment. That was a company goal to solve some issues we had. But as we moved to Spinnaker, we didn't want to move straight into that, right? So the initial step was to basically mimic what our Jenkins deployment pipelines looked like in Spinnaker. So because Jenkins was deploying to our dev environment first, and then people would use a Slack bot to promote to stage or production, there's that kind of manual step in the middle to say for each service when it should go to the next environment. So that's how we initially set up our Spinnaker pipelines. They would deploy to dev, and then it would essentially use a built-in stage in Spinnaker to prompt the user for manual judgment if they want to continue on to stage or production. So that was kind of the first step. We obviously did a POC service first, and then some low touch services that don't really impact too much. And then I looked for a volunteer teams that wanted to get in early. I then moved on to the voluntold people.
Oh, yes. What a process. With that, did you have any concerns around sort of getting engineers on board with changing their method of deploying code? Did you get good buy-in?
Yeah, surprisingly, it went well. I think as the SRE team, we were a bit nervous about something new and getting everyone to change. We have about 160 microservices that are going through these pipelines, and people are constantly pushing out new versions. And they've been doing that with the Slack bot for years. And then now we're putting something new out and having them go to a web interface instead. So just kind of a little bit of a shift in just the mentality of how you do those things. But it went over really well. Everyone seemed to adapt it and not really have any issues.
That's really great. So yeah, I do know we're at the stage now where we do have all of our services migrated over to Spinnaker. So what's next?
Yeah, so next, I guess revisiting that original goal of continuous deployment. We did at a stage in our Spinnaker pipeline to run some tests, and we set it up in a nice way where the tests actually dictate if something can go on out. So initially, like I said, everything is kind of gated, so it's manually, promoted or manually signed off to go to the next environment. But things are set up so the test can give output that Spinnaker can use in its logic, and so things are already in place. I think the biggest step is just getting more tests written that we're confident in. The technology is already there on the Spinnaker side, so the next steps is getting better test coverage, getting more services automatically deploying. And in the meantime, there's some stuff we can do on our side too. So a lot of times as the SRE team, we do, security updates or maybe update versions in our Docker files and things like that. Things that are very low risk, and we can have Spinnaker look at the Git differences and see which files changed. And, if it's low risk and not part of the actual application, maybe those can be continuously deployed anyway. So just trying to get closer to that CD goal.
It's really great. So, we're moving forward with Spinnaker. We've got all of our services there, and we are encouraging our engineers to write more tests so we can move towards that continuous deployment kind of vision. Before we close out though, do you have any advice that you'd share or lessons learned that you would share with maybe other organizations that may be just starting out on their Spinnaker journey?
Yeah, so I had actually heard of Spinnaker quite a while back before we ever considered it. And it always had this reputation, at least to me, that it's very difficult to stand up, but once you have it running, it's very powerful and easy to use. I would push back on that these days. Spinnaker has had a lot of development in the installation space, particularly with Halyard to manage your Spinnaker deployments. And these days, it's really not that difficult to stand up. So my advice would be don't be afraid to play with it. You can even run Minikube or Kind locally, get Spinnaker up and running and play with it pretty easily in a local environment. Aside from that, join the Spinnaker Slack community. It's a great group of folks. They were very helpful to us getting started. And maybe a special shout out to the people over at Armory, who in particular was very helpful for us. But yeah, just join the community and start playing with it.
Well, thanks so much, Jay, for sharing your thoughts and your experience with getting us started with Spinnaker at Upside. For everyone who's watching at home, thank you for joining us. I think we are available for live chat during this time. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Jay. The team at Upside would be happy to talk to you and collaborate. With that, again, thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.